For 13 months between 1966 and 1967, people in Point Pleasant, West Virginia reported seeing the same dark figure with glowing red eyes. Then, on December 15, 1967, the sightings suddenly stopped. That very night, the Silver Bridge collapsed into the Ohio River, killing 46 people. Whether it was a warning or a coincidence remains unknown. In this video, we uncover the most disturbing paranormal encounters. Section 1. The Enfield Poltergeist. On the night of August 31, 1977, Peggy Hodgson phoned the police from her council house in Brimsdown, North London, and told the officer on the line that something inside her home was moving the furniture. She was a single mother raising 4 children, the eldest 13 and the youngest 7, and she was not someone given to calling the police over nothing. She had already tried pushing the furniture back. She had already looked for an explanation and had not found one. She gathered her children, stood in the hallway of the house she had lived in for years, and understood, without being able to say why, that she needed someone else to come and see what was happening. What that someone found when they arrived that night set the Enfield case apart from almost every other reported haunting in British history before a single investigator had been called. Woman Police Constable Carolyn Heaps arrived and found the family gathered in one room, visibly distressed. Peggy's children were Janet, 11 years old, Margaret, 13, Pete, 10, and Billy, 7. Heaps walked through the house looking for an ordinary explanation. She gave a formal statement afterward in which she described watching a chair slide approximately 4 feet across the floor without anyone touching it. She said she had no explanation for what she had seen. She stayed for around half an hour and left without one. That statement changed the character of the case from the start. Most reported hauntings exist entirely within the testimony of the people living inside the affected property. At Enfield, before the investigation had properly begun, a police officer with no connection to the family had already written down, under her own name, that something happened in that house she could not explain. The activity had actually started the night before. On August 30th, Janet and Pete told their mother their beds were shaking. Peggy assumed the children were moving around and told them to settle. Then a chest of drawers began sliding toward the bedroom door on its own. She pushed it back. It moved again. When she tried a third time, she found she could not shift it at all. She gathered the children, went next door to the Nottingham family's house, and called the police from there. In those first weeks, the knocking became the phenomenon most consistently reported by people with no connection to the family. It came from inside the walls, loud enough to be heard from the street. Sometimes it arrived in regular sequences. Sometimes it appeared to respond to questions, tapping once for yes and twice for no. Investigators who tested this found the responses matched their questions often enough to resist easy dismissal. The neighbors who shared the wall with the Hodgsons heard it from their side without being told anything unusual was happening, confirmed it to investigators independently, and said they had no explanation for what was producing the sound. Peggy was not a person who sought that kind of attention. She had been raising 4 children alone since her marriage ended, and had no record of making unusual claims before that August. People who knew her described her as private and practical. The fact that she called the police rather than a newspaper or a paranormal researcher on the first night was noted by later investigators as consistent with someone who wanted an ordinary answer and did not receive one. The Society for Psychical Research sent Maurice Grosse to the house in early September 1977. Grosse was in his mid-50s, an inventor and businessman who had joined the society the previous year following the death of his daughter in a motorcycle accident. He came to Enfield without prior field experience in paranormal investigation. What he brought instead was patience and a methodical habit of mind. He did not arrive with a conclusion and work backward toward it. He sat in the house, watched, and wrote down what he saw. Guy Lyon Playfair joined him shortly afterward. Playfair was a writer and researcher who had spent several years in Brazil examining reported poltergeist cases and had published work on his findings before arriving at Enfield. He came with more theoretical background than Grosse, but approached the investigation with the same basic discipline. Document what happens, apply pressure to claims that seem testable, and keep a record that can be examined afterward. Between September 1977 and late 1978, the two men spent hundreds of hours at 284 Green Street. They did not visit occasionally and file reports. They were there constantly, sitting with the family, watching the children, setting up recording equipment, interviewing neighbors, and maintaining a running log of every incident they witnessed or that was reported to them. By the time the activity subsided, Grosse's log contained more than 2,000 individual entries. No comparable record existed for any British paranormal case of the period. The phenomena they documented during those visits covered a wide range. Marbles and pieces of Lego were thrown across rooms with a force that surprised everyone who witnessed it. A piece of Lego struck photographer Graham Morris on the forehead during an early visit, hard enough to raise a mark. A metal grill found in the house was bent in a way that investigators said was inconsistent with being bent by hand without tools. Water appeared on floors in the middle of rooms with no pipe source above to account for it. Furniture moved during visits when Gross or Playfair were present and watching. Gross himself was struck by a thrown book during one session. He turned immediately and could see nothing in the room that could account for the direction the book had come from. He logged it as it happened. On a separate visit, he watched a cardboard box move along the floor while he was seated with a clear line of sight to it. These were not events reported to him after the fact by the family. He was in the room when they happened. The volume of outside visitors to the house during the investigation was substantial. The Daily Mirror sent photographers and journalists on multiple occasions. The BBC sent a crew. Researchers from other organizations arrived at intervals, some arriving as committed skeptics and some approaching the case more openly. Their conclusions divided along predictable lines. Those who arrived looking for fraud found reasons to suspect it. Those who sat and observed came away with accounts that were harder to categorize. What gave the external testimony its weight was the fact that it came from people with no connection to each other, arriving at different times, from different professional backgrounds, and reporting consistent elements without having compared notes. A police constable, a photographer, television journalists, academic researchers, and multiple neighbors had all, at one point or another, described witnessing something at that house they could not account for through ordinary means. The voice was what changed the nature of the investigation entirely. In the later months of 1977, Janet began producing sounds that were not her natural speaking voice. Everyone who heard it described it the same way: low, hoarse, grating, coming from deep in the chest rather than the throat. It did not sound like a child attempting to disguise her voice. Doctors who examined Janet confirmed she was physically capable of producing that kind of sound, but noted that sustaining it over long periods would eventually cause tissue damage. The voice was recorded on tape by both Gross and Playfair across multiple sessions, and those recordings survived. The voice identified itself as Bill. It claimed to have lived at the address on Green Street and to have died there of a hemorrhage, falling from a chair in the back bedroom. Gross spent time afterward researching the history of the property and located records consistent with a man named Bill having lived there and died in broadly matching circumstances. The degree of precision in that match was disputed. Those who found the case credible considered it significant evidence that the voice had access to information not publicly available. Critics pointed out that a family with local roots could have accumulated that kind of neighborhood history through ordinary means over years of living in the house. While the voice spoke, Janet appeared to have no awareness of what was being said. When it stopped, she reported no memory of the preceding minutes. Playfair sat through extended sessions in which the voice spoke coherently and at length, and described Janet afterward as having no recollection of any of it. The explanation for this was not settled during the investigation, and has not been settled since. The possibilities that were offered at the time included genuine dissociation, a skilled performance maintained without a single significant slip over many months, and something else that the investigation's methods were not equipped to address. None of those possibilities was ever demonstrated. A local Church of England vicar attended the house on several occasions. He did not conduct a formal rite, but described the atmosphere in the building as unlike anything he had encountered in his work, and maintained that description in later years without expanding on it. Representatives from other religious organizations visited at various points during the 14 months, and came away with similarly troubled accounts that did not resolve anything but added to the record of outside observers finding the property unusual. The investigation became significantly more complicated when Janet and Margaret were caught fabricating events. Janet was found to have bent spoons deliberately. She and her sister were discovered bouncing on their beds immediately after reporting that they had levitated. Gross and Playfair did not conceal this when it came to light. Playfair addressed it directly in his 1980 book on the case, arguing that children living inside a prolonged and frightening situation might manufacture additional events alongside genuine ones, for reasons connected to attention, anxiety, or the fact that the investigation had become the primary structure of their daily lives. He maintained that the fabrication did not account for the incidents that had already been observed and logged by adults in the room. The counter-argument was direct. If the central witnesses in an investigation were found to have deliberately deceived investigators, the appropriate response was to extend that skepticism across all of their reported accounts. James Randi, among the most prominent professional skeptics of the period, made this case clearly and publicly. The investigation, in his view, had been conducted by people who wanted to find evidence of something genuine, and that predisposition shaped everything they reported observing. The argument did not resolve. It ran through the 1980s and into subsequent decades, and has not reached a conclusion. Gross died in 2006, still maintaining the position he had held since his first visit to the house. Playfair died in 2018, having spent the intervening years writing and speaking about the case without changing his fundamental assessment. Janet Hodgson has spoken about Enfield in interviews at various points over the decades. She has acknowledged the faking. She has also said she did not fabricate everything that happened. She has described the period as one of sustained fear, and has said that living under sustained examination by researchers, journalists, and strangers who were trying to determine whether she was genuine or a liar was in some ways harder to bear than the events that brought them to the house. She was 11 years old when it started and 13 when it ended, and the case did not leave her when it was over. It followed her across the rest of her life in ways that the investigation logs could not capture. The television dramatizations that arrived decades later reached vastly larger audiences than the original press coverage ever had. They departed from the documented record in ways that were material and sometimes fundamental, inventing events, resolving questions that the original investigators had left deliberately open, and presenting with certainty things that Gross and Playfair had been careful to frame as uncertain. For most people who became aware of the Enfield case in the 2010s, the dramatized version was the reference. The actual case, built from 2,000 logged incidents and hundreds of hours of observation, became background. The tapes of the voice exist. The written logs are held by the Society for Psychical Research. The photographs survive. The formal statements given by W.P.C. Heaps and others in 1977 have not been retracted by those who gave them. What that collection of material proves has not been agreed upon by the people who have spent the most time with it, and the disagreement has not grown simpler with the passage of time. The activity stopped in late 1978. Peggy Hodgson remained at 284 Green Street until her death in 2003. Another family moved in afterward and reported nothing unusual. The house is still there. Janet Hodgson says she does not know what happened. Given everything that was documented in that house across 14 months, that may be the most careful answer anyone connected to the case has ever given. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Enfield ran for 14 months and produced a record that investigators are still arguing over. The next case stretched across 4 years and ended not with an open question, but with a death, a vial of unidentified liquid, and a family in rural Tennessee that never fully recovered from what passed through it. Section 2. The Bell Witch of Adams, Tennessee. Something began at the Bell Farm in Robertson County, Tennessee, in the autumn of 1817, and for more than a year, John Bell told nobody. It started as sounds, knocking from inside the walls at night, a slow, dragging weight across the floorboards, something gnawing in the dark close enough to be heard from the bed. Bell walked the property in the mornings, checked the cabin's structure, looked for animals or gaps in the timber that might account for it, and found nothing that satisfied him. He was a Baptist deacon in a frontier community where a man's standing was built over years and lost in weeks, and whatever was producing those sounds was not something he was willing to discuss until the night it became impossible to stay quiet any longer. John Bell was a prosperous farmer and a deacon in the Red River Baptist Church, a well-regarded figure in a community where that kind of standing required years of consistent conduct to build and maintain. He had a wife named Lucy, several sons including a grown son named John Jr., who would later be the primary recorder of events, and a daughter named Betsy, who was around 12 years old when the first sounds were heard. The family had worked the same property for years without incident. Their position in the community gave them no obvious motive to fabricate something that would invite the level of scrutiny that followed, and in fact, John Bell resisted outside scrutiny for as long as he could manage it. The sounds arrived first, in the later months of 1817. They came at night, knocking against the exterior walls of the cabin, the drag of chains across the floorboards, the noise of something large and slow moving through the house when everyone inside was lying still. Bell went out and checked on multiple occasions and found nothing. He examined the walls, walked the property, looked for animals or neighbors who might explain what the family was hearing. The family's dogs, kept outside, reacted to the nightly sounds with clear distress, pressing against the house or retreating from it, without barking at anything they could track. The sounds eventually moved from the exterior of the building into the interior, and from there into the bedrooms, where family members began reporting something pulling at their bed covers during the night, accompanied by sounds John Jr. later described as resembling lips smacking or something gnawing in the dark, close and without a source. John Bell told almost no one about any of this for over a year. That silence is one of the most consistently underappreciated aspects of the early case. He was a deacon and a landowner in a community built on reputation and mutual regard. Inviting his neighbors to examine something he could not explain was not a step he could take back. When he finally decided to speak to his closest neighbor, James Johnson, it was because the activity had pushed past the threshold he could manage privately. The sounds had grown loud enough to potentially be heard from outside the walls of the building. The disturbances inside had become more physical and more frequent. He needed another set of eyes from someone he trusted to tell him whether he was missing something ordinary. Johnson came and sat through a night at the Bell farm. He confirmed what he heard. He addressed the room directly, speaking in a calm and deliberate way, demanding that whatever was producing the sounds identify itself and explain its purpose. The entity did not speak that night. What it did was respond in the only way it seemed capable of at that stage, tapping and knocking in sequences that Johnson found attentive enough to be unsettling. He left in the morning and told Bell that this needed to be examined by more people than the two of them could provide. Word spread through the months that followed. Neighbors were told. Community figures were brought to the farm to sit and observe. Ministers came. People traveled from further into the region after accounts of the farm circulated through church gatherings and communal meetings. Every one of them arrived expecting to find either nothing or an explanation, and a substantial number of them left without either. The accounts they gave afterward, recorded by John Jr. over the years that followed, were consistent in their fundamental claims without being identical in their details, which is generally considered a better sign of genuine independent observation than coordinated accounts that match precisely. By 1818 and 1819, the farm had begun attracting visitors from well outside the immediate community. People traveled distances that were significant by the road standards of the period, some arriving as confirmed skeptics, others already inclined to believe they would encounter something genuine. Most came without strong prior positions and left with unsettled ones. None of them, in the accounts that survive, produced an explanation that closed the matter to the community's satisfaction. The case remained open in the collective understanding of everyone who had touched it, and it remained that way for as long as John Bell lived. Context matters here. The Red River settlement in the early 19th century was a community shaped by Protestant faith at a level of intensity that is difficult to convey from a modern distance. These were people for whom the existence of spiritual forces was not an abstraction or a metaphor. It was a lived reality that organized the structure of daily life. Ministers occupied specific authority as the community's primary interpreters of spiritual events, and when ministers sat through nights at the Bell farm and came away without a confident explanation, the effect on the community was significant in a way that secular terms struggle to capture. One minister reportedly told his congregation that he had been to the farm and had no account to offer that he felt comfortable giving from a pulpit. That admission, from a man whose role required spiritual authority, was taken seriously by everyone who heard it. What emerged next, over several months of increasing activity, was a voice. It began as something so faint that people in the room during the early sessions argued about whether they had heard anything at all. Over months it grew clearer, and then clearer still, until the entity was communicating with purpose and at length. It sang hymns in a voice those present described as fully formed, accurate in melody and pitch, and pleasant to hear. It quoted scripture in ways that suggested genuine familiarity, rather than rote performance. It knew the names of visitors before being introduced. It provided specific information about people in the room that those people had not disclosed, and that observers said could not have been gathered through any means they were aware of. When visitors arrived with prepared tests, intending to expose a fraud, the accounts they gave afterward describe responses that did not serve their purpose. A visiting man who claimed expertise in detecting supernatural deception ended the encounter, by the accounts of everyone present, on the floor of the Bell home, distressed and unable to explain what had happened to him. The entity's treatment of the Bell family was not uniform across its members, and that selective quality was one of the things outside observers found hardest to fit into any explanatory framework. Lucy Bell was treated with consistent care throughout the entire period of the disturbance. When she fell ill, the entity expressed what witnesses described as genuine concern. It spoke of her with warmth. It brought her fruit, or appeared to, though no witness attempted to explain the mechanism. It never directed harmful attention toward her during 4 years of activity that left the rest of the household under sustained assault. That consistency, maintained across hundreds of hours of witnessed activity in front of people with no connection to each other, was a marked and observable pattern that every account from the period confirms. Betsy Bell occupied an uncomfortable middle ground. She was harmed in ways that were visible and that witnesses attested to directly. Struck hard enough to leave marks. Her hair pulled, slapped in front of people who could not identify the source. Her courtship with a young local man named Joshua Gardner became a focus of the entity's interest in a way that was ongoing and specific. The entity expressed opposition to the relationship directly and repeatedly, in terms that multiple people heard over an extended period. Gardner and Betsy eventually ended the engagement. The entity's interference was documented across the entire period the relationship lasted. John Bell was the center of everything. From the first months of the disturbance through the morning of his death, the entity returned to him with a consistency that set his situation apart from every other element of what was happening in that household. He was struck across the face, in ways that displaced his jaw and left lasting pain. He developed facial spasms that had no identified medical cause, arriving in patterns those around him connected to the most active periods of the disturbance. His ability to eat and drink declined over the years, swallowing becoming difficult and then more difficult. He lost weight that was visible to everyone around him and that could be measured against the man he had been before 1817. His decline was steady and uninterrupted, documented by family members, neighbors, and visiting observers who recorded it as it happened, and it ran in one direction from the beginning to December 20th, 1820. He died that morning. His family found him in a stupor from which ordinary means could not rouse him. Beside him on the floor was a small glass vial, containing a dark liquid that no member of the household had placed there, and that none of them recognized. John Jr. gave a portion of the liquid to the family cat. The cat died within minutes. John Jr. then threw the vial into the fire. The entity, in the accounts preserved in the memoir, spoke during this period, and stated plainly that it had given the old man a dose. John Bell did not recover consciousness. He was dead by the end of the day. The vial is the element of the case that sits most uncomfortably outside the frameworks most commonly used to dismiss it. A troubled household, a patriarch in physical decline for reasons that may have had organic causes not identified in a period of limited medicine, children who had grown up inside an ongoing investigation with strong social reasons to maintain it. These things offer partial accounts of many aspects of the Bell disturbances. The vial does not fit any of them. A liquid of unknown origin, appearing at a specific moment, killing an animal rapidly, accompanied by a spoken claim of responsibility from an entity that had been targeting John Bell for 4 years, requires an explanation that the standard dismissals do not provide. Critics have proposed deliberate human poisoning by someone with household access and a motive to harm Bell. That explanation exists. It is not supported by any identified evidence, and it introduces questions about who that person might have been and how they avoided identification across 4 years of intense community scrutiny that the proposal does not answer. Andrew Jackson's visit to the farm is one of the case's most widely repeated elements, and one of its least verifiable. The accounts that include him describe a party of men, one of whom arrived claiming expertise in exposing fraud, an experience over a single night that ended in disorganized departure, and a statement from Jackson comparing the encounter unfavorably to battle. The source is John Jr.'s memoir and the regional oral tradition. Jackson's documented correspondence contains no reference to the visit. Scholars who have studied Jackson's life have not been able to confirm it through independent sources. It may be true. It may be an embellishment that attached itself to the case over the gap between the events and the writing of the memoir. It should be held at that level of certainty. After John Bell's death, the activity at the farm did not end immediately. It diminished gradually, the entity's manifestations growing less frequent and less intense over the months that followed, until by 1821, the disturbances had effectively ceased. The family continued to live on the property. Lucy Bell remained there for years, the same woman the entity had treated with such consistent warmth, living now in the ordinary quiet that followed years of extraordinary disruption. Local memory of what had happened on the Bell farm did not dissolve when the activity ended. In a settlement where the case had been a living presence for 4 years, witnessed by a substantial portion of the population, it became the kind of event that shaped community identity across generations. Families who had been to the farm passed their accounts to their children. Ministers who had sat through nights there continued to reference the experience carefully, in terms that did not commit them beyond what they had actually observed. The case existed in the community as a settled fact of local history long before John Jr. published his memoir, which meant that when the memoir appeared in 1846, it entered a community already familiar with the central facts and measuring his written account against what their own families had told them. Betsy Bell eventually married Richard Powell, who had been her schoolteacher. She gave no substantial public account of the events during her lifetime. The silence was complete and maintained without exception. Every researcher who has spent serious time with this case has noticed it, and no one has been able to determine what it means. A person who lived through years of documented public intrusion, visible physical assault, a broken engagement, and the prolonged decline and strange death of her father, and who then said nothing publicly for the rest of her life, leaves a shape in the record that cannot be filled by any source that exists. John Jr.'s memoir remains the foundational document. It was written more than 2 decades after the events it describes by a man with an emotional stake in how they were represented. It has shaped memory. Nothing in the independently verifiable accounts of the period contradicts its central claims in any significant way, but that is not the same as confirmation. It is an absence of contradiction, which is as close as the historical record of the Bell case gets to certainty on most points. The farm is gone. Adams, Tennessee holds the case now primarily through tourism. John Bell's grave is maintained and visited. The vial was burned more than 2 centuries ago, and whatever answer it carried was destroyed in that fire. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Tennessee kept its silence after 1821, and the Bell case closed without resolution. What follows is stranger in a different way. Not a slow unraveling across years, but a single night in rural Kentucky in 1955. 11 people inside one farmhouse, and something circling the property that their guns could not stop. Section 3. The Hopkinsville Goblins. The evening of August 21, 1955 had been unremarkable until Billy Ray Taylor stepped outside the Sutton farmhouse near Kelly, Kentucky, to draw water from the well, and came back inside saying he had just watched something fall out of the sky. He described a large luminous object moving over the property and dropping toward a gully about a mile out. The Sutton family listened and reached the most reasonable conclusion available to them. Billy Ray had seen a meteor and gotten turned around about what he was looking at. There were 11 people gathered in the house that evening, and none of them went to check the gully. They returned to what they had been doing, and for a little under an hour, the night stayed ordinary. About an hour later, the dogs outside began making noise in a way that was recognizably different from their ordinary behavior. Not territorial barking directed at a specific point, something closer to panic, pulling toward the house rather than away from it. Lucky and Billy Ray took a .22 rifle and a shotgun and went to the door to see what had disturbed them. What they said they saw standing at the edge of the property, catching the light from the farmhouse, was a figure roughly 3.5 feet tall, with a large round head, enormous eyes that reflected light back at them, long thin arms that extended almost to the ground, and hands described as claw-like or talon-shaped. The figure was moving toward the house with its hands raised. Lucky fired the shotgun. Billy Ray fired the .22. The figure tumbled backward as if the impact had knocked it off its feet, then righted itself and moved away into the darkness. The 2 men said it made no sound when struck. What happened over the next 3 hours was documented by police who arrived later that night, by a newspaper reporter who interviewed the family, and by civilian investigators who came to the farm in the days that followed. The family's account, given under questioning by multiple people in different combinations, did not change in its essential shape from the first telling to the last. 11 people were inside that farmhouse, between roughly 8 in the evening and 11 at night, and they all described the same sequence of events. The figures, and there were at minimum 2 of them based on the family's account, circled the property for hours. They appeared at windows. One reportedly grabbed Lucky Sutton's hair through an open window screen before he pulled free. One was seen on the roof, described as moving across it with an unusual gait, and was shot at from directly below through the roof material. When the family fired at them, the figures did not fall and remained down. The accounts consistently described the things floating or gliding rather than dropping when struck, as if the impact displaced them rather than injured them. No blood was found afterward, no physical remains of any kind. What the family found when they searched after daylight were patches of luminous material on the grass and in the tree line that faded before anyone could collect a sample. The guns were fired repeatedly across those 3 hours. Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor were rural men who grew up handling firearms, and neither of them was described by anyone who knew them as excitable or prone to exaggeration. They were not men who fired at shadows. The volume of ammunition spent over the course of that night was consistent with sustained and repeated targets, and the family's account of where they fired corresponded to the locations they described seeing the figures appear. At roughly 11 at night, the family collectively decided they could not remain in the house until morning. They loaded into their cars and drove to the Hopkinsville police station. 11 people arrived at the station in a state that officers present described as genuine terror. Glennie Sutton, the family matriarch, was a woman of the kind of age and character that officers who met her that night described as not someone given to drama. She was shaking. The children in the group were clearly frightened in the way children are frightened when the adults around them have not managed to pretend everything is fine. Chief of Police Russell Greenwell took the report seriously enough to drive back to the farm with a number of officers and a photographer from the local paper. They arrived in the early hours of August 22 and conducted a thorough examination of the property. They found no intruders. They found no evidence of a hoax being constructed. They found no costumes, no equipment that might have been used to simulate what the family had described, no tracks of conventional footwear, no staging of any kind. What they noted was that the farmhouse interior showed clear signs of people who had been in sustained distress for several hours. Overturned items, holes in walls and the roof from gunfire, spent casings. The officers were not able to explain what the family had been shooting at. The story broke in regional newspapers within days. It drew immediate ridicule in the way that these cases almost always do when they reach a wider public. The family was subjected to the standard dismissals. They had been drinking, they had misidentified animals or a weather balloon or a carnival act passing on a nearby road. They had collectively imagined it or collectively fabricated it for reasons that were never made specific. Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor addressed each of these publicly at the time. The drinking claim irritated them in particular because the Sutton family were Pentecostal Christians who did not keep alcohol in the house, a fact their community confirmed, and that investigators who examined the property found consistent with what was there. The carnival explanation has persisted in skeptical accounts of the case, in a form that is worth addressing carefully. There was a traveling show passing through western Kentucky around that period, and a number of skeptical analyses have proposed that the Suttons saw performers in costume or unusual animals from that show and misidentified them in the dark and the stress of the initial sighting. The problem with this explanation is the duration. A brief initial misidentification in failing light, which might plausibly generate a frightened response, does not account for 3 hours of repeated appearances at close range, at multiple windows, on the roof of the building, in clear light from the farmhouse interior, by 11 people, including adults who fired at the figures with firearms at distances close enough that they could describe hand shapes. The carnival explanation handles the first 30 seconds of the case, and nothing after it. Kenneth Samples, a researcher who examined the case in detail decades later, interviewed surviving family members and found no significant revision in the core account. People who had been children that night, and were by then middle-aged, described the same figures, the same sequence, the same quality of terror in the adults around them. The consistency across decades, in people who had no particular commercial interest in maintaining the story, and who had not spoken publicly about it for years, is the kind of detail that separates the Hopkinsville case from accounts that are clearly reconstructed or embellished over time. These were people who did not particularly want to keep talking about it. They talked about it because what they said had not changed, and they had no reason to pretend it had. The investigator J. Allen Hynek, who spent years as a scientific consultant to the United States Air Force on its official UFO investigation program, and who began his involvement as a committed skeptic, reviewed the Hopkinsville case among many others during that period. He did not offer a specific conclusion about what the Sutton family had encountered, but included it in the category of cases he considered genuinely resistant to conventional explanation. Hynek's standards for that category were strict, developed over years of examining cases specifically looking for ordinary causes. That the Hopkinsville case survived his scrutiny, without being filed under misidentification or hoax, places it in a small group. The physical descriptions given by the family were specific in ways that are worth attending to. The large heads, the enormous eyes with that reflective quality, the long arms terminating in claw-like appendages, the movement, which multiple family members described as more like floating than walking, a gliding quality that made the figures seem slightly out of connection with the ground they were crossing. The luminescence, which was not described as clothing or equipment, but as a property of the figures themselves, as if the light came from inside the skin rather than from any surface. When Lucky Sutton was asked years later to describe them again, he used the same vocabulary he had used in 1955, without variation. Investigators who examined the original police report against his later descriptions found them consistent in every structural detail. The cultural afterlife of the Hopkinsville case has been substantial and not always helpful to understanding what actually happened. The figures entered popular culture in forms ranging from sympathetic to grotesque, were adapted by writers and filmmakers who added details the family never reported, and became attached to broader conversations about extraterrestrial life in ways that the original case does not cleanly support. The Suttons never claimed the figures were from another planet. They described what they saw and what they did in response to it and left the interpretation to others. That modesty in interpretation, from people who had every reason to escalate their claims if they were fabricating, is a consistent feature of the most credible accounts associated with this case. Glennie Sutton died in 1978, still maintaining everything she had said on the night of August 21st. Lucky Sutton died in 1955, not long after the incident, and the timing of his death in the same year as the encounter has sometimes been presented in popular treatments as meaningful. It was not. He died of causes unrelated to the events at the farm, and linking his death to what happened that night is not supported by any evidence. Billy Ray Taylor returned to Pennsylvania and did not seek ongoing public attention for what he had been through. His participation in the event was not a story he built a career around. He was a man who had seen something he could not explain, had spent a night shooting at it, and had then gone home. The farm itself no longer stands in the form it had in 1955. The property and the surrounding area have been visited by researchers and enthusiasts across the 7 decades since the encounter, drawn by the same quality that makes the case persist. 11 witnesses, multiple law enforcement personnel, a thorough search that found no conventional explanation, and a family whose account remained intact across decades of scrutiny, retelling, and pressure to revise. What makes Hopkinsville distinct from most cases in this category is the completeness of the evening as a documented event. It had a beginning time, a location, a specific number of witnesses who were present for the entire duration, a law enforcement response the same night, a physical search of the premises, and a public record established within days of the events. Most paranormal cases are built from fragments, 1 or 2 witnesses, memory that is weeks or months old before it is recorded, absence of contemporaneous official response. Hopkinsville has almost none of those gaps. The shape of the night is clear. What filled it has not been explained. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kentucky closed without an answer in August 1955. The next case begins on a Mississippi riverbank 18 years later, with 2 men and a fishing line, and what was recorded without their knowledge in a police station interview room afterward became some of the most discussed evidence in the history of American paranormal research. Section 4, the Pascagoula Abduction. October 11th, 1973, was a Thursday, and Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker had driven out to the west bank of the Pascagoula River in Mississippi to fish off a pier with no particular expectation of the night beyond a few hours of quiet. They had worked the same shipyard floor and had fished together before, and nothing about the evening suggested it would be different from any other. Within an hour of dropping their lines, both men would walk into the Jackson County Sheriff's Department in a state that the officers who received them described as genuine and unmanufactured terror. A recording device left running in the room where the 2 men were left alone afterward would capture 30 minutes of conversation between people who had no idea anyone was listening, and that tape would become the most discussed piece of evidence the case ever produced. Hickson was 42 years old, a foreman at a shipyard in Pascagoula. Parker was 19 and worked alongside him. They were not close friends in the social sense, but they knew each other well enough from working the same floor, and they had fished together before. Hickson was the older man, the more settled one, the kind of working person who spent his evenings doing quiet, ordinary things, and had no particular history of unusual claims. Parker was young enough that the night of October 11 caught him at a point in his life where he had not yet developed the resources to carry what happened to him, and the gap between what those resources could hold and what he was asked to hold with them shaped the rest of his life in ways that the case record only partially captures. They had been fishing for perhaps an hour when both men reported hearing a sound they described as a zipping or buzzing, low and mechanical, coming from somewhere above and behind them. A craft of some kind, oval in shape and glowing with a bluish light, appeared over the river. Neither man ran. The accounts they gave afterward describe a kind of paralysis, not the ordinary freezing of surprise, but something more total, a physical inability to move that arrived without warning and remained throughout what followed. They described figures emerging from the craft, 3 of them, pale and wrinkled, moving without bending their legs, their arms ending not in hands but in claw-like appendages that closed around both men and lifted them from the pier. Hickson reported being floated inside the craft, unable to control his body, examined by what he described as a mechanical eye that moved over him without touching him. He said the experience lasted between 15 and 20 minutes before he was returned to the pier. Parker, by his own account given years later in more detail than he offered initially, lost consciousness early in the encounter and regained it on the ground at the water's edge. He said for many years that he did not remember what had happened to him inside the craft, and later in his life revised that account, saying he did remember and had been unable to speak about it for decades. What he disclosed in later years described an experience of a deeply personal and disturbing nature that he maintained had taken him a long time to accept, as something that had genuinely happened to him. The two men sat on the pier afterward for an unknown period of time. Neither was able to say how long they remained there before they moved. Eventually, they got into Hickson's car and drove, not home, but to the local offices of the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, where Hickson went inside and asked to speak to someone. The account he gave at the front desk was coherent and specific, and the officer who received it made the decision to take it seriously rather than dismiss it outright, which is one of the less examined decisions in the chain of events that shaped what the case became. Sheriff Fred Diamond and Captain Glenn Ryder took the two men into separate rooms and questioned them independently. The accounts they gave did not contradict each other. The descriptions of the craft, the figures, the physical experience of being moved without control, the duration, the return to the pier, matched across both interviews in the ways that matter for assessing whether two people are describing the same event rather than constructing one together. After the formal interviews concluded, an officer made a decision that would define the evidentiary record of the Pascagoula case for everything that came after. He left a recording device running in the room where Hickson and Parker were sitting alone together and did not tell them it was active. The recording exists. It runs for approximately 30 minutes and captures the two men talking to each other in the absence of any official audience, in the interval between the interview and whatever came next. What the tape contains is not two men coordinating a story or congratulating each other on what they had performed. What it contains is sustained fear. Hickson moves between moments of attempting to calm Parker and moments of barely contained panic himself. Parker, who had been largely composed during the formal interview, is audibly falling apart. He prays. He tells Hickson he is not going to be able to handle what has happened to him. Hickson tells him they have to keep it together, that nobody is going to believe them, that they need to stay calm and stick to exactly what happened, because it is the truth. A recording of two men performing a hoax for an audience does not sound like that tape. A recording of two men who have just invented a story and told it to law enforcement does not contain that quality of unguarded distress, maintained across 30 minutes when both men believed no one was listening. Skeptics of the case have proposed that Hickson and Parker were aware the tape was running and performed accordingly. This is a possible position. It requires the assumption that two men with no prior history of staging elaborate deceptions were capable of sustaining 30 minutes of detailed, internally consistent emotional performance while believing they were alone, with no indication in the recording of any moment in which the performance slipped, or either man broke character, in the way that people do when they are pretending and believe no one is watching. The tape has been listened to by researchers across the decades since 1973. And the consensus among those who have heard it is that it does not sound like a performance. Dr. James Harder, a professor of civil engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, who was also a researcher with the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, traveled to Pascagoula within days to interview both men. He conducted hypnotic regression sessions with Hickson and concluded that what he observed during those sessions was consistent with genuine traumatic memory rather than constructed narrative. Alan Hynek, who had by 1973 spent nearly 25 years examining cases like this for the United States Air Force, and had begun his career as one of the most determined skeptics in the field, also spoke with Hickson and came away without a conventional explanation to offer. Neither man's opinion constitutes proof of anything. What they contribute is the assessment of two people with extensive experience evaluating claims of this kind, who examined this specific case at close range and did not find the ordinary explanation satisfying. Hickson gave his account publicly and consistently, from October 1973 until his death in September 2011. He spoke to researchers, journalists, documentary makers, and private individuals across nearly 4 decades. And the account he gave the week after the encounter on the Pascagoula River was the account he was still giving at the end of his life. He did not elaborate it in the ways that fabricated stories tend to elaborate over time, gathering detail and drama with each retelling. He said what he said in 1973, and he continued saying it. The details that he had offered with uncertainty, remained uncertain. The details he had been clear about remained clear. That consistency, across 38 years and an enormous amount of pressure from people who wanted him to either expand his account dramatically or retract it entirely, is one of the most notable features of his testimony. Parker's path was different and considerably harder. He suffered what was described at the time as a nervous breakdown in the weeks following the encounter, and required care that took him away from his ordinary life for a period that disrupted everything he had been building. He did not speak publicly in any sustained way for many years. When he eventually did, the experience he described of those intervening decades was one of a person trying to contain something that resisted containment, a memory of an event so far outside his framework for understanding his own life that he had spent years trying to find a way to live around it, rather than through it. His eventual book, published in 2018, contained disclosures he had not made in 1973 and that he said had taken him 45 years to be able to put into words. Whether those additional details represent recovered memory, gradual willingness to disclose things he had known all along, or the natural elaboration of a story over time, is a question the record does not answer cleanly. The wider context of October 1973 is worth placing alongside the Pascagoula case, because it is unusual. The fall of 1973 was one of the most concentrated periods of reported encounters in American history, with cases filed across multiple states in a compressed time window. Researchers who have examined the period have offered various explanations for the clustering: a social contagion effect driven by media coverage of early cases, genuine atmospheric or other conditions that might account for unusual sightings across a wide geographic area, or simply the statistical reality that when reporting of one case receives wide coverage, other people who had similar experiences and had stayed silent become willing to speak. None of those explanations is mutually exclusive, and none of them accounts for the specific evidence of the Pascagoula case, which existed independent of the wider cluster in the form of the covert tape, the independent interviews, and the two men's documented physical states on the night they walked into the sheriff's office. The pier where Hickson and Parker were fishing no longer exists in the form it had in 1973. The area has changed around it over 50 years. What remains is the case file, the tape recording, the contemporaneous newspaper accounts, and the records of what Harder and Hynek observed when they examined the two men. Pascagoula itself has never fully settled into a position on what happened to two of its residents on that riverbank. The case is acknowledged locally, without being celebrated, present in the community's awareness without being a point of civic pride. It sits there the way unresolved things sit, too real to dismiss and too strange to absorb. Hickson said in one of his later interviews that he wished it had never happened. Not in the sense of someone performing reluctance while continuing to seek attention, but in the flatter sense of a man who had spent nearly 40 years carrying something heavy that he had not asked to carry, and that he could not set down. He believed what he said had happened. He said so consistently until the end of his life. That is what the record shows. What the record does not show is what happened on that river, on the night of October 11, 1973, in any terms that resolve the question of what the two men actually encountered. The tape is real. The interviews are real. The distress was witnessed and documented by people with no stake in manufacturing it. The explanation that connects those pieces of evidence to a coherent account of reality is the thing that has not been found in the 50 years since Hickson walked into the Jackson County Sheriff's Department and asked someone to listen to him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Mississippi in 1973 left two men changed in ways that neither of them fully recovered from. The next case is different in almost every structural sense. Not two witnesses in the dark by a river, but more than 200 people standing in full daylight on a school morning in suburban Melbourne, watching something descend from an open sky. Section 5. The Westall UFO Wednesday, April 6, 1966, gave the students of Westall High School and the adjacent Westall State School in Clayton South, Melbourne, no indication that it would be different from any other midweek morning. Classes were running their usual sequence. Teachers were at the fronts of rooms, and the children were moving toward their break with the ordinary restlessness of a school day that had not yet produced anything worth remembering. What happened in the 20 minutes that followed left more than 200 students and staff as witnesses to something no official body has formally explained in the 60 years since. And by the end of that same afternoon, the children had been told by the adults responsible for them that they had not seen it. A student noticed something in the sky above the oval. Then another student noticed. Then a group of them were at the windows, and then they were outside, and within minutes, a substantial portion of both schools was standing on the grounds, watching a disc-shaped object move through the air above the suburb, descend toward an open paddock on the far side of a stand of pine trees the local children called the Grange, and disappear from view below the tree line. What happened in the next 20 minutes produced over 200 witnesses and an official silence that lasted decades. The object was described consistently across the accounts that were gathered from students and teachers in the days and years following the event. It was round, or close to round, slightly domed on top, silver gray in color, and it moved without producing any sound that the witnesses could hear from the school grounds. Some described a faint haze or shimmer around its edges. The size estimates varied in the way size estimates always vary when people are judging an unfamiliar object at an imprecisely known distance. but the shape described by witnesses who gave accounts independently of each other was consistent enough to constitute a pattern rather than a collection of individual impressions. The object descended below the pine trees and out of sight. Several dozen students immediately ran toward the grange to get closer. They pushed through the tree line into the open paddock on the other side, a piece of open ground known locally as Cook's Paddock, and some of them reached the far end of the field in time to see the object lift from the grass and accelerate away over the trees at a speed that multiple witnesses described as unlike anything they had seen an aircraft achieve. It went from stationary to gone in a period that witnesses estimated as a matter of seconds. What was left in the paddock was a flattened circle of grass. The students who reached it first described it clearly. The grass pressed down in a circular pattern, still green, but laid flat in a way that was visibly different from the undisturbed growth around it. Several students crouched and touched it. Others stood at the edge. By the time teachers arrived and began pulling students back toward the school, a number of them had seen the circle from close range, and their descriptions of it in subsequent accounts match without being identical, which is the pattern of genuine shared observation rather than collaborative construction. A girl named Jacqueline was brought back from the paddock in a state of visible distress, described by students and at least one teacher as having collapsed or fainted near the area where the object had rested. The nature of what had affected her was not established. She was cared for by school staff, and the episode was not followed up publicly in any documented way that survived into the later record. Her experience near the landing site was mentioned by multiple witnesses who were there that morning and who described her condition as genuinely alarming at the time. One of the most significant witnesses from the teaching staff was Andrew Greenwood, a science teacher at Westall High School, who watched the object from the school grounds for an extended period and gave one of the most detailed accounts from any adult present that day. Greenwood described the object with the specificity of someone trained to observe and record, and his account matched the student accounts in its essential features. He also became one of the most outspoken witnesses in the years following the event, expressing frustration at the way the incident was handled by school authorities and, he believed, by government agencies in the period immediately after. The school principal called an assembly that afternoon. The accounts of what was said at that assembly have been given by former students in interviews conducted across the decades since 1966, and while the precise wording naturally varies with time and memory, the substance of what former students describe is consistent. They were told not to discuss what they had seen, not to talk to the press, and to treat the morning as something that had not happened. Several former students have described this instruction as being delivered with an emphasis that went beyond ordinary school discipline, a quality of pressure that stuck with them because it was unusual enough to be memorable 40 and 50 years later. What followed in the days after April 6 has been described by multiple former witnesses as a visitation by men who did not identify themselves clearly and who spoke to students, teachers, and at least one parent with a directness about the subject of silence that those witnesses found alarming rather than reassuring. Who these men represented, whether they were connected to the Royal Australian Air Force, to another government body, or to some other organization, was not established at the time and has not been established since. The witness accounts of these visits are consistent in their description of the men's manner and their message. Whether those accounts are accurate in every detail after half a century cannot be confirmed, but the consistency across people who had not compared notes for decades is a feature of the Westall record that researchers have consistently noted. The Royal Australian Air Force's involvement in the immediate aftermath has been a persistent element of the Westall case. Former students and at least one teacher described RAF personnel arriving at the school and at the paddock on the day of the event, or within a day of it. Official RAF records examined in subsequent years showed no logged response to the Westall area on April 6, 1966. The absence of a logged response can mean the response did not happen. It can also mean the response was not logged, which is a different thing. Researchers who have worked on the case have been unable to move past that ambiguity because the documents that would resolve it either do not exist or have not been made available. Several witnesses described light aircraft circling the area during or immediately after the object's presence over the suburb. The number of aircraft reported varied across accounts, with estimates ranging from 2 to 5. These aircraft were described as smaller propeller planes rather than military jets, circling in a pattern that suggested they were tracking or following the object rather than passing through the area by coincidence. Whether those aircraft were civilian, military, or government-connected was not established. Their presence was reported by enough independent witnesses that researchers who have examined the case consider it a credible element of the overall account, while acknowledging that the interpretation of what they were doing remains open. Sharon Hutchinson, who later married and is now known as Sharon Fraser, was one of the students who ran to the paddock that morning and reached the flattened circle. She has spoken about the experience in multiple interviews across the decades, beginning in the period when researchers first began collecting Westall accounts in a systematic way, and continuing into recent years. Her account has not changed in its essential details. She describes what she saw in the paddock with the kind of unguarded specificity that comes from a genuine memory rather than a constructed one, and she has expressed across many years the same combination of certainty about what she observed and frustration at having been told to be quiet about it before she had the age or standing to push back. Terry Peck, another former student, has given similar accounts. So have dozens of others whose names appear in the documentary record compiled by researchers who began seriously interviewing Westall witnesses in the early 2000s, nearly 40 years after the event. The passage of time between April 1966 and the beginning of systematic research on the case is one of its most significant challenges. Memory across 4 decades is not the same as a contemporaneous statement given to police the same night. Details erode, reshape themselves around what has been read or heard in the intervening years, and acquire a patina of narrative coherence that immediate accounts do not have. Researchers working on Westall have acknowledged this openly and have attempted to weight their findings accordingly, focusing on the elements of the account that are consistent across witnesses who had not been in contact with each other and who had no obvious reason to maintain a coordinated story. The physical trace evidence, the flattened circle in Cook's paddock, was not formally investigated by any official body on the day of the event. By the time any formal interest was expressed in the site, the circle had largely recovered. Grass grows back. The window for collecting physical samples, measuring the affected area with precision instruments, or conducting soil analysis closed within days and was not reopened. What the circle might have demonstrated under proper examination cannot be known, because proper examination did not take place. Whether that failure was deliberate or simply a consequence of the bureaucratic speed at which official responses to unusual events moved in 1966 has not been determined. The Westall case was largely unknown outside Australia and outside the community of paranormal researchers until a documentary film brought it to wider attention in the mid-2000s. The film brought many of the former students together for the first time in decades and recorded their accounts in a format that preserved both the content of what they said and the manner in which they said it. Watching people in their 50s and 60s describe something they witnessed as children, without drama or embellishment, with the particular flatness of people who have lived with an unresolved memory for most of their adult lives, carries a quality that transcends the specific content of any single account. These were ordinary Australians from an ordinary suburb who had seen something one morning and had spent the following decades quietly certain of what it was, without the means to prove it to anyone who had not been standing on those school grounds with them. The suburb of Clayton South has changed around the site of the event. The school is still there. The paddock and the pine trees have been altered by development over 60 years. The specific geography of that morning in 1966 exists now primarily in the memories of the people who were present and in the documentary record those memories have generated. That record is substantial. It represents a larger body of independent witness testimony than almost any other case of its kind from the same period, gathered from people who had no obvious motive for maintaining a collective fiction across most of their adult lives. What descended into Cook's paddock on April 6, 1966, rested for a period in the grass, and lifted away over the pine trees has not been identified. The Royal Australian Air Force has never provided an explanation. No government body has ever officially addressed what 200 people witnessed that morning. The circle in the grass grew back. The morning moved into afternoon, and then into the following day, and the official record of April 6, 1966, in Clayton South, Melbourne, shows nothing unusual at all. The witnesses are still there. Most of them are in their 70s now. They remember a Wednesday morning in autumn when something came down out of the sky while they were at school, and they remember being told, before the day was out, that they had not seen it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Australia closed its file without an answer, and the witnesses carried that morning quietly for the rest of their lives. The next case moves to the edge of a Suffolk forest in the dead of an English winter, where United States Air Force personnel filed formal reports, recorded audio as events unfolded in real time, and a senior officer sent a written memo to the British Ministry of Defence that still exists today. Section 6. The Rendlesham Forest Incident. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt submitted a formal memo to the British Ministry of Defence on January 13, 1981, 3 weeks after events at RAF Woodbridge in Suffolk that he had personally witnessed and partly recorded on audio tape. The memo was declassified in 1983 and has been publicly available since. It described a physical craft in Rendlesham Forest, radiation readings at a landing site, and lights that moved through the trees, with a purposeful quality he could not account for through any conventional means. It was written on official stationery, under his name and his rank, by a serving senior officer, with everything to lose professionally, if what he was reporting was later found to be fabricated or false. It has never been withdrawn. What it describes has never been officially explained. The night of December 25, moving into the early hours of December 26, was cold and clear. Security personnel patrolling the eastern edge of the base reported seeing lights in the forest beyond the perimeter fence. Lights that did not behave like aircraft and did not match the navigational pattern of the nearby Orfordness Lighthouse, which was the explanation initially offered and subsequently investigated and rejected by the senior officers who looked into it. Sergeant Jim Peniston and Airman First Class John Burroughs were among the first personnel sent to investigate. They went through the fence line and into the forest on foot. What Peniston described in the immediate aftermath, and has continued to describe across the decades since, is a craft of some kind, physical and solid, resting on the forest floor among the trees. He described it as triangular, roughly 9 feet across and 6 feet high at its peak, with a smooth surface that appeared to be made of a material he had no reference for, black and glossy, warm to the touch. He said it was covered in markings that he did not recognize as any writing system he knew, arranged in a pattern that covered a section of the surface. He described taking out his notebook and transcribing those markings by hand, copying them as carefully as he could in the dark and the cold with the object directly in front of him. He said the craft eventually lifted from the ground, moved through the trees without striking them, and accelerated away. His notebook, containing the transcribed markings, survived. It has been examined by researchers and by people with backgrounds in linguistics and symbolic systems, none of whom has produced a definitive identification of what the symbols represent. Burroughs was present throughout the encounter and has given broadly consistent accounts of the experience, while differing from Peniston on some specific details, which is the normal pattern of two people describing a shared experience from slightly different positions and states of attention. The core of what both men reported, a physical object in the forest, lights, a craft of unusual character, has not changed across their accounts over more than 4 decades. Neither man has retracted what he said. Both have maintained their accounts under conditions that included significant professional and personal pressure to qualify or withdraw them. The physical evidence found at the site the following morning was examined by base personnel and logged. 3 depressions were found in the forest floor in a triangular arrangement, at intervals consistent with landing gear for an object of the size Peniston described. They were roughly 7 inches in diameter and approximately 1.5 inches deep. Radiation readings were taken at the site using a Geiger counter by base security staff. The readings were elevated at the depression sites compared to the surrounding area, with the highest readings recorded inside the impressions themselves. These measurements were logged at the time, and while the radiation levels recorded were not at a level considered acutely dangerous, their presence at the specific location where the craft had reportedly rested was noted by investigators as requiring explanation that was not forthcoming. The case would have remained a single-night incident reported by 2 junior airmen had it ended there. It did not end there. 2 nights later, on the night of December 27th, moving into December 28th, the activity in the forest resumed. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt was the deputy base commander at RAF Woodbridge. He was a senior officer, experienced and precise in his professional manner, not someone given to hasty conclusions or dramatic reporting. When personnel reported further activity in the forest on the night of the 27th, Halt went out himself with a small group to investigate. He brought a portable cassette recorder and narrated what he was observing in real time as the investigation proceeded. He did this because he expected to find an ordinary explanation quickly and wanted a contemporaneous record of the investigation process. What the tape captured instead was something considerably more difficult to account for. The recording runs for approximately 18 minutes. In it, Halt can be heard directing his team through the forest, describing lights moving among the trees, a red light that he describes as pulsing and moving with a purpose that he finds inconsistent with any conventional light source he can identify. At one point, he describes the light appearing to drip, as if molten material were falling from it. The team moves toward the lights repeatedly, and the lights move away, maintaining distance in a way Halt narrates as responsive rather than coincidental. Later in the recording, Halt describes beams of light coming down from above, striking the ground near the team's position, in pulses and at intervals. The tone of the recording is what makes it singular among the documents associated with this case. It is not a dramatic performance. It is a senior military officer doing his job, narrating observed phenomena in the flat and precise language of someone accustomed to filing accurate reports, becoming progressively less able to account for what he is seeing, and continuing to narrate it because that is what his training tells him to do. He does not sound frightened. He sounds like a man whose framework for what is possible is being tested by what is in front of him, and who is processing that test in real time with a recorder running. The tape was not made for public consumption. It was a working document. That quality is what gives it its particular weight in the record. Halt later wrote a formal memo to the British Ministry of Defence, dated January 13, 1981, in which he reported the events of both nights in official terms. The memo was declassified in 1983 and has been publicly available since then. It describes the landing site evidence, the radiation readings, the lights observed on the second night, and the beams of light directed at the ground. It was written by a serving senior officer to a government ministry, under his own name and rank, on official stationery. It is not a personal account or a retrospective claim. It is a contemporaneous official document generated within 3 weeks of the events it describes, by a man with everything to lose professionally if he was later found to have filed an inaccurate or fabricated report to a foreign government ministry. The British Ministry of Defence's response to the Halt memo, and to the Rendlesham case more broadly, was to acknowledge its receipt and indicate that the events described did not appear to represent a threat to national security. No further official investigation was announced at the time. Documents released under Freedom of Information requests in subsequent years showed that the ministry had been aware of the case, had received the memo, and had not conducted any thorough investigation into what had occurred at and around the base during those 2 nights. The reason that absence of investigation was considered adequate by the relevant officials has not been explained in any documentation that has been made public. Peniston's account became more complex over time, in ways that have been the subject of considerable discussion among researchers. In 1994, under hypnotic regression conducted by a researcher, Peniston produced an account of his time close to the craft that contained elements not present in his original 1980 report, including a claimed communication of some kind from the object. He also later stated that the binary code contained within the markings he had transcribed in his notebook, when translated, produced a message with a specific content that he disclosed publicly. Researchers who have examined the binary interpretation have offered varying assessments, from those who find it credible to those who consider it a later addition to a story that was already extraordinary enough on its own terms. The complexity introduced by the hypnotic regression material is acknowledged by almost all serious researchers on the case as requiring a more cautious approach to Peniston's expanded claims, while not invalidating what he reported in December 1980, before any regression took place. Burroughs has pursued the case on grounds that are distinct from the question of what the craft was. He became seriously ill in the years following the incident, developing cardiac problems significant enough to require intervention. He sought his military medical records in connection with his treatment and discovered that records from the period around December 1980 had been classified in a way that prevented him from accessing them, including records relevant to his medical care. The effort to have those records declassified, in order to properly treat his condition, involved years of correspondence and official engagement, and the classified status of medical records from the period of the Rendlesham encounter, in the files of a man who had been present at the site, was noted by his supporters and by some members of the United States Senate, who became involved in his case, as itself a form of documentation that something significant had occurred. The Orfordness Lighthouse explanation has been the most persistently offered conventional account of the Rendlesham lights. The lighthouse is visible from parts of the forest, and its rotating beam produces an intermittent light at the right distance, to potentially be confusing in certain conditions. Researchers who support this explanation have produced diagrams and calculations showing how a rotating lighthouse beam might be misidentified by observers in an unfamiliar terrain. Halt addressed this explanation directly and repeatedly in his later interviews, stating that he was a trained military officer who had operated in the field, that his team was aware of the lighthouse before entering the forest, that they observed both the lighthouse and the other lights simultaneously on the second night, and that what he was narrating on the tape was not the lighthouse beam. He has said this in precise terms, with the particular quality of irritation of someone whose specific and direct answer to a specific question continues to be ignored in favor of repeating the question. The base at RAF Woodbridge was returned to the British government in 1993, as American military presence in the United Kingdom was reduced following the end of the Cold War. The forest is still there, managed by the Forestry Commission, open to walkers. The site where the craft reportedly landed on the first night is marked, and the area draws visitors from many countries who come specifically because of what was reported in December 1980. The forest is quiet in winter, the pines very close together, the light reduced to what comes through the canopy, and the walk from the former base perimeter to the landing site is not long, but the density of the trees is enough to give anyone passing through it a clear sense of how isolated the experience of being inside it, at 2 in the morning in December, would have been. Charles Halt retired from the Air Force at the rank of lieutenant colonel and has spoken publicly about the Rendlesham case for many years. He has called for an official investigation on multiple occasions. He has said plainly that what his team observed on the night of December 27th was not explained by any phenomenon he has encountered in a long military career, and that the failure of official bodies on both sides of the Atlantic to properly investigate what a senior officer formally reported to a government ministry within 3 weeks of it happening is a failure he considers significant. He has not changed his position. He has not retracted his memo. The memo is still there, in the public domain, carrying his name and his rank, and the date of January 13, 1981, saying what it says. The Rendlesham Forest incident occupies a particular place in the history of cases of this kind, because its documentation is not retrospective. The tape was made as events unfolded. The memo was written within weeks. The landing site was examined, and the readings logged before the story reached the press. The physical trace evidence was found by personnel with no prior commitment to finding it. The case was built from the inside out, by people doing their jobs, before it became a case at all. That structural quality does not resolve what happened in Rendlesham Forest in the final days of December 1980. It does make it considerably harder to dismiss. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Suffolk in December 1980 left a formal paper trail that has never been adequately explained. The next case has no government memos and no military recordings. What it has instead is 62 children, a school morning in Zimbabwe, and drawings produced within hours of the event that researchers who examined them independently found more difficult to account for than almost anything else in the documented record. Section 7. The Aerial School Encounter. 62 children were on the school grounds at the Aerial School in Rua, Zimbabwe, on the morning of September 16, 1994, unsupervised during their morning break while their teachers attended a staff meeting inside, when something came down at the edge of the field that none of them has been able to explain in the 30 years since. They drew it within hours of seeing it, described it independently to their headmaster, then to a veteran researcher, then to a BBC journalist, then to a Harvard psychiatrist, and the accounts they gave across all of those separate conversations did not change in any significant way. The drawings those children produced that afternoon, before they had been given extended time to compare or align what they were saying, remain among the most discussed documents in the history of cases of this kind. Rua sits about 20 kilometers east of Harare on the Zimbabwe Highveld, a modest, quietly prosperous town of red dirt roads and low acacia trees. The Aerial School was a well-regarded private school, small enough that staff knew every child by name, and that morning its teachers were inside the main building attending a staff meeting. No adults were supervising the field behind the school. The children were between 6 and 12 years old, and they had been given the hour with the particular freedom that unsupervised break time carries, loose and full of noise, spread across the grounds without structure or direction. What they reported seeing, what they drew within hours of seeing it, and what they told a Harvard psychiatrist 2 months later without any meaningful revision to their original accounts, has not been explained in the 30 years since that morning. Several children noticed the objects first. The descriptions given independently across the group in the hours immediately following were consistent in their essential shape: small, disc-shaped craft, silver in color, moving through the sky above the field in ways that did not correspond to any aircraft the children recognized. Some of the objects appeared to descend toward a rough patch of scrubland beyond the boundary of the school grounds, a rocky, brushy area the children were not permitted to enter. One object, in the accounts given by the majority of witnesses, came down at the edge of that area, either landing fully or coming close enough to the ground that the distinction did not matter to the children watching it. Some of them ran toward it. The youngest children, several of whom were 6 and 7 years old, ran in the opposite direction, toward the school building, crying and looking for an adult. That split response, some children moving forward out of curiosity and others retreating out of fear, is itself a detail that researchers examining the case have consistently noted as consistent with genuine rather than manufactured experience. A coordinated fabrication tends to give everyone the same response. What the teachers found when they emerged from the staff meeting was a field full of children reacting in the varied and uncoordinated ways that real fright produces. The figure, or figures the children described near the craft, were where the accounts became most specific and most uniform. A being of small stature, dressed in what several children described as a tight black suit, with a head noticeably large relative to the body, and eyes that every child who described the face returned to as the most striking and most disturbing feature. Very large eyes, dark, dominating the face in a proportion that was wrong by any human standard. Multiple children said the figure looked directly at them from across the field. Multiple children said that when it did, something was communicated that did not involve sound or movement, a quality of meaning arriving without a carrier, an impression rather than a message, which they struggled to articulate but described in terms that were consistent across children who had not yet had the opportunity to compare their experiences with each other. The staff meeting ended, and the teachers came out to find the situation already in progress. Colin Mackey, the school's headmaster, began speaking to children in groups, and then separately, asking them to describe what had happened, and, crucially, asking them to draw what they had seen before the school day ended. That decision to collect drawings immediately, before the children had been given extended time together to discuss and align their accounts, was one of the most consequential choices made in the handling of the Ariel case. The drawings were produced that afternoon. They showed a craft of consistent configuration, a figure of broadly similar proportion, and the large eyes reproduced by child after child in a way that was recognizably similar, without being identical, the pattern of independent observation of the same object, rather than a shared template passed around the classroom. Cynthia Hind was a Zimbabwean journalist and UFO researcher who had spent many years investigating reported sightings across southern Africa. She was contacted within days of the event and arrived at the school before the case had received any significant outside attention. Her approach was methodical. She interviewed children separately, collected the drawings alongside her own notes from each interview, spoke at length with the teachers and with Mackey, and built a document of the case that was detailed enough to serve as a fixed baseline against which all later accounts could be measured. She was not an uncritical investigator. She had spent years applying pressure to reports that did not survive scrutiny, and she brought the same pressure to Ariel. The consistency she found across 62 children, in separate interviews conducted within days of the event, was something she described as unlike anything she had previously encountered in her research. Dr. John Mack heard about the case through connections between the Zimbabwean research community and his work in the United States. Mack was a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and the winner of a Pulitzer Prize for biography, a figure of serious academic standing who had spent several years before 1994 studying people who reported encounters with non-human beings, approaching those reports not as a believer, but as a clinician, trying to understand their psychological reality. His methodology was standard psychiatric practice applied to non-standard content, and his willingness to take these accounts seriously as data worthy of clinical attention had already cost him considerably in professional terms before he boarded a plane for Zimbabwe in November 1994. He arrived 2 months after the event. He conducted filmed interviews with a number of the Ariel students, working through an interpreter where necessary, using the open-ended questioning style of a trained clinician who understood that the way a question is framed shapes the answer it receives. He did not suggest details to the children. He did not offer frameworks within which to organize their experience. He gave them space and listened to what filled it. What filled it was consistent with what Cynthia Hind had documented in the days immediately after September 16th, in accounts given before Mack had any involvement in the case, and before the children had been exposed to any significant outside framing of what they had seen. The filmed interviews are available and have been watched by a large number of people over the 30 years since they were made. What they show, and what researchers and ordinary viewers alike have consistently described when asked about their impression of the footage, is children who are not performing. The particular qualities of genuine testimony are visible throughout: the searching for words at the edges of experience that language does not easily reach, the self-correction, the confidence at the center of the account, where the memory is clear, and the uncertainty at its margins where it is not. The unresolved quality of distress that sits in the face and posture of someone describing something that has not been processed to a conclusion. These qualities are not impossible to fake. They are very difficult to sustain consistently across a large number of children of varying ages who are being interviewed separately by a trained psychiatrist who is specifically attentive to signs of fabrication or coaching. One girl, around 11 years old at the time of filming, described what the figure appeared to communicate to her across the distance of the field. Not words, not sound. Something more immediate than either, an impression of concern about the state of the world, about the direction of human technology and what it was doing to the planet, delivered in a form she could only describe as a feeling that arrived fully formed. Other children described similar impressions in similar terms, each reaching for their own language for an experience that ordinary language was not built to carry. Mack wrote later that the thematic consistency of this element across children who had not discussed it with each other was among the most striking features of his interviews, and that it was not content he would have expected children of that age and background to generate independently if they were constructing a story rather than reporting an experience. The BBC journalist Tim Leach filmed additional material during the interview sessions. His footage, together with Mack's, preserved the children's accounts in a form that does not depend on written records or later recollection, which is an evidentiary advantage that most cases of this kind do not have. The footage exists as a fixed document against which the children's later adult accounts can be compared, and that comparison has been made by researchers who have examined both. What the adult accounts contain is the same essential content as the drawings produced on the afternoon of September 16, 1994, refined by adult vocabulary but identical in structural terms. The craft, the figure, the eyes, the quality of communication that was not communication in any ordinary sense. Emily Trim and Salma Siddiq are among the former Ariel students who have spoken most publicly as adults. Both have given interviews across different years and in different contexts, and both have described the experience as something that shaped the direction of their adult thinking and lives in ways that have not diminished with time. Trim has spoken about feeling a responsibility to discuss the experience precisely because it has not been explained, and about the difficulty of carrying a clear memory of something that has no place in the frameworks most people use to organize their understanding of reality. Neither woman has revised the central account. Neither has elaborated it in the directions that a fabricated story typically elaborates when given decades to develop. What they describe now is what they drew at age 10 and 11 on a Zimbabwe afternoon, while the memory was still immediate. The standard skeptical position on cases involving child witnesses is that children are particularly susceptible to social contagion, that a report from one or two children can move rapidly through a group, gathering emotional weight and shared detail as it goes, until a substantial number of children have genuinely convinced themselves of a shared experience that originated in something much smaller or simpler. This is a well-documented psychological phenomenon, and it is not irrelevant to the Ariel case. The difficulty in applying it here is the timeline. The teachers emerging from the staff meeting encountered children already in distress, already describing the event in consistent terms, before any significant period had elapsed in which contagion at that scale could have operated. The drawings were collected before the children had been given extended time together. The initial accounts reached Mackey and then Hind in a form that was already consistent before any outside figure arrived to provide a framework. The site at the edge of the school grounds was examined in the days following the event. Investigators reported a depression in the earth at the location the children had indicated, along with disturbance of the surrounding vegetation. The physical evidence was not formally documented with scientific precision, partly because the investigation was conducted by civilian researchers without specialist equipment, and partly because no official body treated the site as a location warranting formal examination. The Zimbabwean government did not investigate. No military or intelligence agency involvement was reported in any form that left a documentary trace. The school received no official visit of the kind that followed the Westall case in Australia. The children were interviewed by a researcher, then by a psychiatrist, and then largely left to carry what they had seen without any institutional acknowledgement that what they were carrying was real. The question of what 62 children at different ages, with different temperaments, different levels of susceptibility to suggestion, and different relationships to the social dynamics of their peer group, could have uniformly fabricated or misidentified on that morning, has not been satisfactorily answered by any explanation offered in the 30 years since the event. The mundane explanations that typically account for reported encounters, misidentified aircraft, weather phenomena, atmospheric optical effects, do not account for a figure standing at the edge of a field, making eye contact with children across a distance they could estimate because it was their own school grounds, a distance they walked every day. John Mack died in London in August 2004, struck by a car while walking back from a dinner. He had spent the final decade of his life in a sustained professional argument with his institution about the validity of treating these accounts as data worthy of serious clinical attention. He did not claim certainty about what the children had seen. He claimed that dismissing their accounts without rigorous investigation was not defensible from a scientific standpoint, and that the Ariel case in particular, with its volume of witnesses, its immediate documentation, and its filmed record, represented exactly the kind of evidence that demanded a response more considered than silence. His position cost him within his professional community, and he maintained it until the end of his life. The Ariel School is still operating in Ruwa. The field where the children gathered that morning is still there, the scrubland at its edge, The area the children were not permitted to enter is still there. The drawings produced that September afternoon are held among the records of the original investigation, fixed documents of what 62 children saw and tried to put on paper within hours of seeing it. The children of that morning are in their late 30s and early 40s now. Some of them have children of their own, approaching the ages they were in 1994. They grew up and scattered across different adult lives, different countries, different careers, and the break time on September 16 has stayed with them in the specific and undiminishing way that a genuine experience stays, not as a story that gets told, but as a thing that happened, that has no explanation, and that sits in the structure of who they are, in a way that ordinary school mornings do not. They drew it the same afternoon it occurred. They are still describing it the same way now. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Zimbabwe left 62 witnesses and no explanation. The next case moves to a terraced house in West Yorkshire, where what began with green foam from a kitchen tap slowly became something that left marks on the walls, and a dark figure standing in the hallway that more than one person saw. Section 8. The Pontefract Poltergeist. In the last week of August 1966, with Joe and Jean Pritchard away on holiday, their 15-year-old son Philip and his grandmother were alone in the family's council house at 30 East Drive in Pontefract, West Yorkshire, when a fine white powder began falling from the kitchen ceiling. There was no crack in the plaster, no damage to any pipe above, nothing in the structure of the building that accounted for it. They swept it up and looked for a cause and did not find one. Within days, pools of water were appearing on the kitchen floor, with no identifiable source anywhere in the building's infrastructure. The water board sent an official. He examined the pipes, traced the nearest water sources, found nothing, and left. The powder continued falling. The water kept appearing. What came through that house across the years that followed left marks on walls, a dark figure standing in the hallway that more than one person saw, and a case record substantial enough for researchers to place it among the most extensively documented poltergeist investigations in British history. The Pritchard family lived there. Joe and Jean Pritchard, their teenage son Philip, their younger daughter Diane, and Joe's mother Doris, who was known to everyone as Grandma Scholes. In the last week of August 1966, Joe and Jean took a holiday, leaving Philip, who was 15, and Grandma Scholes at the house. It was an ordinary domestic arrangement, two family members holding things together for a week while the parents were away. What happened during that week was the beginning of something that did not end when Joe and Jean came home. It started with chalk dust, a fine white powder falling from the ceiling of the kitchen, settling on the surfaces below, with no visible source above. Philip and Grandma Scholes swept it up and looked for an explanation, and found none. The ceiling was intact. There was no plaster cracking, no pipe damage, nothing that accounted for powder falling steadily from an unmarked surface. A day or so later, the pool of water appeared on the kitchen floor, directly below where the powder had fallen, again with no source. The nearest pipe was not leaking. The ceiling above showed no sign of damp. The water was simply there, in the middle of the floor, in a room that had been dry moments before. Grandma Scholes called the water board. An official came to the house, examined the kitchen thoroughly, traced the nearest pipes, and could not identify a source for what she was describing. He left without explanation. The water board sent no follow-up. The official conclusion, by default, was that there was nothing to conclude. Whatever was producing the pools of water on the kitchen floor of 30 East Drive was not anything in the building's infrastructure, and the absence of an official explanation did not stop it from happening again. When Joe and Jean returned from holiday, they came home to a house that had already begun to change around the people living inside it. The chalk dust and water were only the opening of it. Over the weeks that followed, activity spread through the house in ways that escalated in both frequency and character. Plants were pulled from their pots and left on the floor. Ornaments moved from shelves to positions that nobody had placed them in. The lights behaved in ways that the wiring could not account for, turning on and off without anybody at the switches. A heavy piece of furniture in the kitchen pushed itself away from the wall, while Jean Pritchard stood watching it, with no one near it and nothing visible against it. Jean's sister, Marie Kelly, witnessed the furniture incident and gave her own account of it independently. That detail matters for the same reason it mattered at Enfield. The events at 30 East Drive did not belong exclusively to the testimony of the people who lived there. Visitors who came to the house with no prior knowledge of what had been happening encountered things they were unable to explain before they had been told what to expect. The accumulation of outside witnesses at Pontefract followed the same pattern that the most credible poltergeist cases tend to produce: a widening circle of independent observers, arriving at different times, from different starting positions of skepticism or credulity, and leaving with accounts that were consistent in their essential content. The activity moved through phases. There was a period in the early months in which it subsided almost entirely, long enough for the family to wonder whether it had ended, before returning with renewed intensity. Researchers who have studied multiple poltergeist cases have noted this pattern of remission and return as a recurring feature, a quality of the phenomenon that makes it particularly difficult to investigate systematically, because the periods of quiet give no warning before they end. The Pritchards would go days without incident, begin to recover some ordinary sense of their home, and then find themselves back inside something they could neither explain nor predict. Philip was the child most centrally placed in the activity during the early period, which fitted a pattern that investigators examining poltergeist cases had observed in other documented instances, the phenomenon appearing to cluster around an adolescent member of the household. Diane was younger and initially less central to the reported activity, though that would change as the years progressed, and the character of what was happening in the house shifted towards something more physical and more targeted. Whether the clustering around adolescence reflected something about the psychology of the reporting, or something about the nature of the phenomenon itself, was a question that researchers examining the Pontefract case, like those examining others of its kind, were unable to resolve. Joe Pritchard was a practical man who did not come naturally to the idea that something beyond ordinary explanation was occurring in his home. His instinct, repeated across the early months of the disturbance, was to look for a physical cause and to keep looking until he found one. He checked the structure of the house methodically. He examined the walls, the floors, the ceiling spaces, the plumbing, and the electrical system. He had people with relevant expertise look at specific elements of the building that might have accounted for what the family was experiencing. None of these investigations produced an explanation that held. The building was structurally sound. The wiring was not producing the effects reported. The plumbing was intact. Whatever was happening inside 30 East Drive, it was not the house. The figure appeared for the first time in the later phase of the disturbance, and its arrival marked a shift in the character of the case that everyone connected to it recognized as significant. It was described consistently by those who saw it as tall, dark, and robed, the outline suggesting a cowled habit of the kind associated with medieval religious orders. It was seen in the hallway. It was seen on the stairs. It appeared without sound, and left without sound, present for moments that were long enough to be clearly observed and then gone, before anyone could do more than register what they were seeing. Jean Pritchard saw it. Diane saw it. Visitors to the house saw it. Each description, given independently and in varying states of shock or disbelief, described the same figure. Diane's experiences with the figure became the most alarming aspect of the case as the years progressed. She was reportedly grabbed on the staircase and dragged upward by something she could not see, her feet leaving the ground, marks left on her neck that her family and at least one visitor to the house documented. The figure that appeared in the hallway and on the stairs was associated in the family's experience and in the accounts of people who investigated the case with whatever force was producing the physical events in the house, though whether that association was causal or circumstantial was not something any investigator was able to determine. The connection that researchers drew between the figure and the local history of the site became one of the most widely discussed elements of the Pontefract case. The town has a documented medieval history that includes the presence of a Cluniac priory, the remains of which lie not far from East Drive. Historical records from the period of the priory's operation include an account of a monk who was hanged for the rape and murder of a young girl, an execution that local historical sources place in the general vicinity of what became the Pontefract residential streets. The overlay between this history and the appearance of a cowled figure in a council house on East Drive was not lost on the researchers who examined the case, and it entered the popular account of the haunting as the figure's primary identity, the Black Monk of Pontefract. The degree to which the historical connection is genuinely meaningful, rather than a compelling narrative imposed on an ambiguous set of events, is a question that serious investigators of the case have handled with appropriate care. The existence of a Cluniac priory in the town is documented. The existence of an execution of a monk for the crimes described is less firmly established in the surviving historical record, sourced primarily from local historical tradition rather than from formal ecclesiastical or legal documentation that has been independently verified. What can be said is that the geographical relationship between the priory site and East Drive is real, and that the connection was not invented after the figure was reported, but was drawn by researchers who were examining the site's history in response to what witnesses had already described seeing. Colin Wilson, the writer and researcher who had spent years examining paranormal cases with a discipline that valued evidence over atmosphere, visited the house and spoke with the family. He found the Pritchards credible. He found the volume of outside witness testimony difficult to dismiss. He was not a person who accepted claims uncritically, and his assessment of the Pontefract case as genuinely resistant to ordinary explanation was not a casual one. He included it in his work on the subject as one of the cases that most challenged the available frameworks for understanding what poltergeist activity was and what produced it. Researchers who came to 30 East Drive across the years of the disturbance found a family that was not seeking attention in any promotional sense. The Pritchards did not approach newspapers in the way that families manufacturing a story for gain tend to do. They spoke to researchers and investigators who found them through the existing network of paranormal research, and they gave those people access to the house and to their accounts without the kind of management that a fabrication requires. People who came to the house unexpectedly, arriving without warning, reported experiencing events that the family had not staged for them, in moments when no elaborate preparation would have been possible. The spontaneous nature of the incidents witnessed by outside observers, arriving without warning in random sequences that could not have been prepared, was the feature of the Pontefract case that its investigators consistently cited as most difficult to account for through any theory of deliberate deception. The physical evidence left by the disturbance was documented across the years it continued. Crucifixes were pulled from walls. Pictures were slashed in ways that left marks inconsistent with any tool the family possessed. Objects belonging to the family were damaged in ways that required a specific application of force that nobody present could account for. The marks left on Diane's neck were seen by people outside the family. The pattern of damage to objects in the house accumulated over a period of years, leaving a record that was visible to anyone who came inside, and that record remained consistent with the events the family reported, rather than contradicting them in any specific way. The activity at 30 East Drive diminished and eventually stopped, as poltergeist disturbances in the documented record tend to do, without a clear event marking the end. There was no exorcism that demonstrably worked, no confrontation that resolved anything, no moment in which whatever was present in the house was addressed and departed. It simply became less frequent, and then infrequent, and then absent. The family had lived inside it for years. The children had grown up alongside it. Diane was a young woman by the time it ended, having spent a significant portion of her childhood in a house that was doing things to her that nobody could explain. What that experience left in its wake, in terms of the psychological and emotional residue carried by the people who had lived through it, is not something the case files can fully document. The house at 30 East Drive has had a subsequent history that is unusual. After the Pritchard family's connection to the property ended, it passed through various hands and eventually became a location available to rent for overnight stays by people interested in paranormal investigation. Researchers and enthusiasts who have spent nights there have reported experiences ranging from nothing at all to incidents that they found difficult to explain, and those reports have accumulated in the years since the property became publicly accessible. Whether what those visitors report is connected to what the Pritchards experienced between 1966 and the early 1970s, or is the product of expectation operating on ordinary experience in a charged environment, or represents something independent of either, is not a question the current record can answer. The house attracts the kind of attention it attracts because of what was documented there by a working-class Yorkshire family over several years. People who had no framework for what was happening to them, and who did not seek the attention it eventually brought. The Black Monk of Pontefract, as the case has been known since the figure was first described, entered a broader cultural awareness through books and eventually through a film dramatization that reached audiences far beyond the original research community. The dramatization, as dramatizations of these cases tend to do, added elements not present in the documented record and resolved questions that the original investigators had deliberately left open. The actual case, built from family testimony and the accounts of independent visitors across years of activity, is both more modest and more durable than its dramatized version. It does not resolve. It does not offer an explanation. What it offers is a family's account of years spent in a house that behaved in ways their walls and wiring and plumbing could not account for. A figure in the hallway that more than one person saw, marks on a young girl's neck that more than one person documented, and an investigation record that remains open because the people who built it were not able to close it. The Pritchard family did not ask for what came into their house in the late summer of 1966. They looked for explanations until they exhausted the ordinary ones. They endured years of disruption to their domestic life, with a resilience that the people who investigated the case consistently remarked upon. A family trying to maintain the routines of ordinary life inside circumstances that were anything but ordinary. Whatever came through the door of 30 East Drive during those years, it did not come because they invited it, and it did not leave because they asked it to. It left when it was ready, without explanation, the same way it arrived. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. West Yorkshire closed without resolution, and the house on East Drive still stands. The next case moves to the high desert of northeastern Utah, where a family bought a working cattle ranch in 1994, and within weeks found themselves inside something that no amount of practical thinking could account for. Section 9. Skinwalker Ranch. Terry Sherman noticed the locks the day his family moved onto the property. Every door and window of the ranch house on the 512-acre, spread in the Uinta Basin of northeastern Utah, had been fitted with heavy-gauge deadbolts, including the interior doors, the kind of hardware that suggests the previous occupants were trying to keep something out, rather than simply securing a building. The ranch had sat empty for 7 years. The people who had lived there before had left no note and offered no explanation for what they had installed or why. The Shermans were practical ranchers who had worked Utah land for years, and they noted the locks as unusual, made no particular decision about them, and moved in. It took less than a week for the property to demonstrate why the locks had been there. Within days of their arrival, the family encountered the first animal. It appeared at the edge of the property, large enough to be immediately remarkable, described by Terry Sherman as resembling a cattle dog but on a scale that was wrong for any dog breed he knew, closer in size to a small horse than to any domestic animal. It was calm, it allowed Terry and Gwen to approach it, permitted them to pet it, showed no aggression and no agitation. They assumed it had been left behind by the previous owners and made no immediate attempt to remove it. Sometime later that same day, it seized one of the Sherman's calves by the head. Terry pulled at the dog and could not move it. He hit it hard enough to feel the impact through his arm. The animal did not respond. It held the calf until it released of its own decision, turned, and walked across the pasture and into a stand of trees at the property's edge. Terry followed. The trees were not dense. There was nowhere for an animal of that size to go without being visible for a considerable distance. The dog was gone. The grass and soil at the tree line showed no tracks. That first week established the quality that would define the Shermans' 3 years on the property. The events arrived through ordinary channels and exited through impossible ones. Things that began as explicable, a large dog, a sound in the pasture at night, a shape in the sky at dusk, consistently resolved into something that had no explanation available at the end of it. The cattle mutilations began in the weeks that followed. Calves were found dead with no wound that accounted for the death, no blood present, no tracks of predator or human around the carcass. The cause of death unidentifiable by the veterinarians the Shermans consulted. One animal was found with its ear removed in a manner that left a cut so precise that the attending vet described it as surgical in character. The tissue around the cut showed no tearing, no bruising, no sign of the animal having struggled. The calf had been alive and healthy the previous evening. By morning, it was dead and altered in ways that a predator, a disease, or any ordinary agency the Shermans could identify did not produce. What accumulated over the following months was a collection of events that resisted any single explanatory framework. Luminous orbs appeared above the property at night, moving with what witnesses described as directional intelligence, rather than the drift of atmospheric phenomena, sometimes hovering, sometimes accelerating to distances that took them out of sight before their light diminished. Terry Sherman and members of his family watched these objects on numerous occasions, sometimes from close range, and described them consistently. Softball-sized, orange or white, silent, capable of speeds and directional changes that were inconsistent with any conventional aircraft or atmospheric condition. On one occasion, an orb moved into a section of pasture where a calf was standing, and the calf was not there when the light moved on. It was not found on the property afterward. The manner of its disappearance was not recorded, because no one was close enough to see it happen. What was recorded was the calf's presence before the orb arrived and its absence after. Objects inside the ranch house disappeared from locked rooms. The Shermans would place something in a room they then secured, return to find the room still locked and the object gone. This happened repeatedly, with different objects, in circumstances that ruled out the family members as the explanation, because the disappearances occurred when the relevant people were not in the house. Tools left in fixed locations were found elsewhere, or not found at all. The effect was cumulative and demoralizing in the specific way that an environment which cannot be trusted to remain consistent demoralizes the people living inside it. The Shermans were not people who frightened easily. They were working ranchers who had lived with the practical difficulties of agricultural life for years without complaint. What was happening on the property pushed past the thresholds that practical resilience was built to handle. The incident with the large unknown animal occurred some months into their time on the property, and was the event that Terry Sherman subsequently described most often when asked about the ranch. He encountered it in daylight, at close range, in the pasture. Its description did not correspond to any animal native to Utah, or to any predator he had encountered in years of ranching in the region. Very large, dark, moving with a quality he described as wrong. An impression that the animal's relationship to the physical space it was occupying was not quite right, in a way he could not make more specific than that. He fired at it from a distance of a few meters with a hunting rifle. The animal appeared unaffected. He fired again. He watched the shots connect and watched the animal fail to respond in any way that a physical impact produces. It turned and moved away from him across the pasture, and he followed it, and it was not there when he reached the place it had been. He found 3 cores of compacted soil at that location, each roughly 4 inches in diameter and 18 inches deep, arranged in a triangular pattern in the pasture grass. The soil inside the cores was compressed in a way that was inconsistent with any natural process he could identify, and inconsistent with any equipment used on the property. He documented them and showed them to other people. They were examined, and no explanation for their formation was produced. Gwen Sherman and the children were affected differently from Terry, but no less substantially. Gwen described a sustained feeling of being watched on the property that was independent of any specific incident, a background quality of observation that did not lift when nothing was visibly happening. The children were moved to live off the property at a certain point in the family's tenure because the environment had become too disrupted to support the ordinary routines that children require. That decision, made by practical parents whose instinct was to manage problems through action, was an acknowledgement that what was happening on the ranch had moved past the level at which management was possible. The Ute people of the Uinta Basin had a long history with the land the Shermans had purchased. Their oral tradition included sustained reference to an entity or class of entities associated with the region, a presence that their elders had warned about and that their cultural practice was organized partly around avoiding. The term that researchers and journalists later attached to the property, Skinwalker Ranch, derived from the Navajo concept of the skinwalker, a different cultural tradition, and its application to the Uinta Basin property, was contested by Ute community members who felt it misrepresented their own specific relationship with the land. What the Ute tradition and the Navajo concept shared was the acknowledgement of something dangerous and non-human occupying certain landscapes, and several Ute elders who were made aware of the Sherman family's experiences described what was happening on the property as consistent with what their tradition had always held about that particular piece of ground. The Shermans sold the ranch in 1996, having spent approximately 2 years on the property, under conditions that had progressively made ordinary ranching life impossible. The buyer was Robert Bigelow, a Las Vegas businessman with a long-standing interest in paranormal phenomena, who had the resources to approach the property not as a family home, but as a research site. Bigelow established what he called the National Institute for Discovery Science, and placed a team of scientists and investigators on the ranch to document and study whatever was occurring there. The researchers who lived and worked on the property during the Bigelow ownership period reported experiences consistent with what the Shermans had described, and the volume of documented incidents from that period, gathered by people with scientific training and recording equipment, added a layer to the case that the Sherman family's personal accounts alone could not have provided. What those researchers reported, in documentation that became available in fragmented form through journalism and later through more direct disclosure, included continued cattle mutilations with no identifiable cause, continued luminous objects above the property, electronic equipment malfunctioning in ways inconsistent with the environment, and at least one incident involving a large, unidentified animal that researchers tracked across the property and lost under conditions that should not have allowed it to disappear. The scientific framing of these reports did not make them easier to explain. It made them harder to dismiss. George Knapp, the Las Vegas journalist who first brought the Skinwalker Ranch story to a wide public audience through his reporting in the late 1990s, and Colm Kelleher, a scientist who worked on the property during the Bigelow period, co-authored a book in 2005 that laid out the documented record of events across both the Sherman era and the research period. Their account was careful in its distinction between confirmed observations and interpretation, flagging the places where the evidence was strong and the places where it was ambiguous, and presenting the overall picture of the property as something that the scientific methods available to them had not been able to explain. That modesty in the face of extraordinary claims was noted by researchers who examined the book as a quality that distinguished it from most popular treatments of paranormal cases. The Shermans' accounts, gathered before any commercial interest had attached to the property, and before anyone had reason to curate or manage the story for an audience, are the evidentiary bedrock of the Skinwalker case. Terry Sherman was not a man who sought what came to him. He bought a cattle ranch and tried to run it, and found that the land he had purchased would not behave as land is supposed to behave. He sold it after 2 years and went back to farming elsewhere. The things he described in his early interviews, given to Knapp before the case became publicly known, are the things he continued to describe in later years without revision or elaboration. The large dog at the tree line, the shots that connected with nothing, the calves that were there and then were not, the lights above the pasture at night. The property has had a complicated subsequent history. It passed from Bigelow to a new owner, Brandon Fugel, in 2016, and became the subject of a television series that brought it to an audience vastly larger than anything the original research period had reached. That visibility has generated the same problem that television attention always generates for cases of this kind. The signal of the original documented events becomes harder to hear beneath the noise of production values, dramatic framing, and the commercial incentives that shape what gets shown and how. The Shermans' 2 years on that property, their practical and unperforming account of what happened to them there, exists at a remove from the media property the ranch has become, and holding those two things separately requires a deliberate act of attention. The Uinta Basin itself is unusual in ways that predate and surround the specific history of the ranch. The concentration of reported anomalous events in the region over decades, including livestock deaths, reported craft sightings, and encounters described by multiple families with no connection to each other, has been noted by researchers examining the broader geography of the area. The ranch sits inside a landscape with a history of reported phenomena that its most famous property has come to represent, but did not originate. Whatever the Uinta Basin holds, the Shermans were not the first people to find it, and they were not the last. They were simply the ones whose experience was documented closely enough and early enough, and by people with enough discipline, to leave a record that the subsequent noise has not fully buried. Terry Sherman sold the property and left. He has said in interviews that he does not miss it and that he does not return. He has said that what happened on that ranch was real, that he has no explanation for it, and that he has spent the years since trying to live an ordinary life on land that behaves the way land is supposed to behave. By the accounts available, he has managed it. The ranch has not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Utah left a research team on a property they could not explain, and a family that drove away and did not look back. The final case goes to a small city on the Ohio River in West Virginia, where for 13 months, something was seen in the sky above the town, and then the bridge fell. Section 10. The Mothman of Point Pleasant. On the night of November 15, 1966, two young couples driving through an abandoned wartime munitions plant north of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, reported seeing something standing near one of the old generator buildings that sent them accelerating back toward town. In a state of fear, they carried into the sheriff's department the same night. Their report was the first formal account of what would become 13 months of sightings above a small river city that ended on December 15, 1967, when the Silver Bridge collapsed into the Ohio River and took 46 people with it. Between those two dates, Point Pleasant accumulated one of the most geographically concentrated and witness-consistent clusters of reported encounters in American paranormal history, documented in real time by a local journalist who took the accounts seriously from the beginning, and by a researcher who spent enough of that year in the area to watch it happen around him. The Silver Bridge had stood across the Ohio River since 1928, connecting Point Pleasant, West Virginia to Gallipolis, Ohio, carrying the daily traffic of a small river city that had grown around it and come to take it for granted, the way communities take infrastructure for granted when it has always been there. On the evening of December 15, 1967, the bridge was carrying its usual load of rush-hour vehicles when an eye-bar in the suspension chain failed. The collapse took less than a minute. 46 people died in the river. It remains one of the most deadly bridge failures in American history, and it ended something that had been happening in the sky above Point Pleasant for 13 months. The sightings had begun in November 1966. They would accumulate across the following year into one of the most geographically concentrated and witness-rich clusters of reported encounters in American paranormal history, involving people from different parts of the county, in different circumstances, who gave accounts that were consistent in their essential description, without being identical in their details. What they described was large, taller than a man, gray or dark in color, with wings that folded against its body when it was standing, and spread to a span that witnesses estimated at 10 feet or more when it moved. The eyes were what every witness returned to, red, reflective, positioned on the upper part of the body in a way that was not quite where eyes should be, catching light in the way that animal eyes catch headlights. deeply unsettling to everyone who found themselves looking into them. Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Mallette were two young couples who encountered the figure on the night of November 15, 1966, near the abandoned World War II munitions plant north of Point Pleasant, known locally as the TNT area, a stretch of land that had been left to grow back into scrub and woodland since the war's end, and that teenagers and young adults used for the ordinary purposes that abandoned places away from town tend to serve. The four of them were driving through the area when their headlights caught something standing near one of the old generator buildings. They described it as man-shaped, but wrong in its proportions. The wings folded at its back, the red eyes fixed on the car. They left quickly. They said it followed them, keeping pace with the vehicle at speeds they estimated at over 100 miles per hour along the highway back toward town, rising above the car at one point and then dropping back, gone by the time they reached the city limits. They reported the encounter to Deputy Millard Halstead that same night. Halstead took their account seriously enough to drive out to the TNT area with them and examine the location where they had first seen the figure. He found nothing. The four witnesses were not people with any history of making unusual claims, and Halstead's assessment of them in the immediate aftermath of the interview was that they were genuinely frightened and genuinely convinced of what they had described. His willingness to treat the report as credible, rather than dismissing it, set a tone for how local law enforcement engaged with the subsequent wave of sightings, which was, by the standards of official responses to paranormal claims, unusually open and consistent. The story broke in local newspapers within days. Reporter Mary Heyer of the Athens Messenger, who covered the Point Pleasant area, was one of the first journalists to take the accounts seriously and pursue them with investigative attention rather than ridicule. Her reporting across the following months built a documentary record of sightings as they accumulated, interviewing witnesses at the time they came forward, rather than years after the fact, preserving accounts in a form close enough to the original experience to carry its character. She became a central figure in the community's processing of what was happening, a reliable and respected presence for witnesses who were trying to find someone who would listen without mocking them, and her records from that period represent some of the most valuable contemporaneous documentation the Mothman case produced. The TNT area appeared again and again in the accounts that followed, through November and December 1966 and into 1967. The old munitions plant, with its network of concrete igloos scattered through the overgrown land, seemed to draw both sightings and the witnesses who came looking for them. And the geography of the place, dark, maze-like, full of structures that produced unexpected shapes in headlights, contributed to an atmosphere that made it difficult to separate what people genuinely encountered there from what the environment primed them to expect. Researchers who have examined the Mothman case carefully have consistently noted this problem without being able to resolve it. The TNT area was both a genuine site of reported encounters and a location whose character was suggestive enough to generate false positives in ways that are impossible to quantify from the outside. The figure was not seen only at the TNT area and not only at night. Newell Partridge, a contractor who lived in Salem, about 90 miles from Point Pleasant, reported that on the night of November 14, 1966, the night before the Scarberry and Mallette encounter, his television screen had blanked and filled with a pattern he could not account for, and that his dog had then begun behaving in a way that took the animal away from the house and into the darkness outside. He went to look and said he caught two red reflective points of light with his flashlight at the edge of the tree line, at a height and spacing consistent with the description that would emerge the following night from witnesses who had no connection to him. His dog did not come back. He found no trace of it. The timing of his account, reported before the Scarberry sighting became public knowledge, was noted by researchers as a feature that complicated any theory of social contagion, generating the subsequent wave of sightings. John Keel was a journalist and researcher who arrived in Point Pleasant in 1967 and spent enough time in the area across that year to produce a book on the case that remains the most substantial single document generated by the Mothman period. Keel was not an uncritical believer in the accounts he gathered, but he was also not a person who began with a conventional explanation and fitted the evidence to it. He interviewed witnesses extensively, traveled the county, attended the scene of multiple reported sightings, and developed a picture of the 13-month period that was broad enough to convey the full texture of what was being reported, rather than selecting only the most dramatic elements. His account of the community during that year is as valuable as his documentation of the sightings themselves. A small American city that had become the center of something it did not understand, and was processing that situation with a mixture of fear, dark humor, communal solidarity, and the specific bewilderment of people who had no framework for what was happening around them. The sightings did not follow a single pattern. Some witnesses described an encounter of seconds, a shape in the headlights, red eyes turning toward them, the sudden impulse to leave. Others reported longer encounters, minutes of observation, the figure standing or moving at close range, in conditions that gave the witness enough time to register details. A woman named Connie Carpenter reported seeing the figure in the daylight in a field near Mason and described it landing near her car and moving toward her before she drove away. The daylight detail distinguished her account from many others and was noted by researchers as significant, since the most common explanations for the sightings relied on the distortions that darkness and headlights produce, explanations that do not apply to an encounter in the open in daylight. The sandhill crane was the most persistent conventional explanation offered for the Mothman sightings, proposed on the basis that a large bird with an unusual flight profile and reflective eyes might be misidentified by frightened witnesses in poor visibility. The sandhill crane can stand nearly 4 feet tall and has a wingspan approaching 7 feet, and it is not common in West Virginia, which means an unexpected encounter with one might produce a dramatic reaction from someone who did not recognize the species. Researchers who examined the witness accounts against the crane hypothesis noted that while it might account for some fraction of the reported sightings, specifically those involving a brief glimpse of something large and airborne in darkness, it did not account for the accounts in which witnesses described the figure standing upright, matching the speed of a moving vehicle over a sustained distance, or appearing in conditions of sufficient light and proximity that the witness had extended time to observe it. The crane explanation handles the edges of the case and not its center. The encounters continued at intervals through the spring and summer of 1967, less concentrated than the initial burst in late 1966, but persistent enough to maintain the community's heightened state of attention. Strange lights were reported in the sky above the Ohio River Valley throughout that period, some described as connected to the figure and some described independently. People claimed telephone interference, receiving static-filled calls from voices they did not recognize, making statements that were later described as warnings, though the content of what was supposedly communicated varied enough across accounts to resist being treated as a coherent pattern. Keel documented these peripheral reports alongside the sightings themselves, and the picture that emerged was of a community in a state of sustained anomalous experience that went beyond any single phenomenon and resisted being organized into a simple narrative. By the autumn of 1967, the frequency of reported sightings had diminished. Whether this reflected a genuine reduction in whatever was occurring in the area, or a reduction in reporting driven by the normalization of something that had been strange in November 1966 and had become part of the local atmosphere by October 1967, is not something the record can determine. The community was living inside the experience in a way that made it harder to step outside and document it cleanly, and the accounts from that later period have a different quality from the first reports, more tired, less sharp at their edges, the product of people who had been inside something for a year and had exhausted some of their capacity for acute attention to it. The bridge fell on December 15, 1967. The failure of the eye-bar that initiated the collapse was later attributed to a stress corrosion cracking process that had been developing in the metal for years, a slow structural failure, invisible from the surface, the kind of thing that inspections of the period were not equipped to detect. The engineering explanation for the collapse is not in dispute. What has been discussed, from 1967 onward, is the relationship between the collapse and the concentration of anomalous events that preceded it in the same location across the same period. The witnesses who reported seeing the figure in the months before the collapse did not, in the contemporaneous accounts documented by Heyer and Keel, describe it as a warning. They described it as frightening and inexplicable. The interpretation of the Mothman as a harbinger, a presence that appears in advance of catastrophe, and whose appearance constitutes a signal of what is coming, developed after the bridge fell and was applied retrospectively to the 13-month period that preceded the disaster. Keel's book, published in 1975, shaped that interpretive frame significantly, and it has proved durable because the chronological coincidence is real. Something was being reported above Point Pleasant for over a year. It stopped being reported, and the night it stopped, the bridge fell into the river and took 46 people with it. Whether that sequence is causal, coincidental, or something that does not fit either of those categories cleanly is a question that cannot be answered with the tools available to anyone who has tried to answer it. The collapse has an engineering explanation that accounts for the physical failure in precise mechanical terms. The explanation for what was seen above Point Pleasant in the 13 months preceding the collapse has not been identified. Those two facts coexist in the record without resolving each other. The way things coexist when the available frameworks for understanding them are not quite large enough to hold everything that happened. Mary Heyer continued to cover the Point Pleasant area until her death in 1970. She had been a reliable and careful documenter of the Mothman period, and her loss removed the journalist who had been closest to the original events. Roger and Linda Scarberry, whose encounter on November 15, 1966 was the first to receive wide public attention, gave consistent accounts of what they saw near the TNT generator building across the years that followed. Roger Scarberry died in 2009 without revising what he had reported to Deputy Halstead on the night it happened. His account, given in the first hours after the encounter, is the account that survived. Point Pleasant built a statue of the Mothman in 2003, a gleaming silver figure with wings spread and red eyes, positioned in the center of town as a piece of civic identity constructed from something that had terrified the community 36 years earlier. The statue draws visitors. The town holds an annual Mothman festival. The abandoned TNT area is still there north of the city, still overgrown, still visited by people who come because of what was reported in its vicinity across those 13 months. The Ohio River moves past the place where the Silver Bridge stood, and a newer bridge carries the traffic that the old one used to carry, and the water does not hold the shape of what fell into it in December 1967. The 46 people who died when the bridge collapsed left behind families who carried that loss into the rest of their lives in the ordinary, devastating way that sudden and violent loss is carried. Their deaths had an explanation, a failure of metal under stress over time, the kind of failure that better inspection practice might have caught and did not. The explanation for what was seen above their city in the year before those deaths has not arrived in the more than 5 decades since the bridge fell. It may not arrive. The record of the 13-month period is what it is. A collection of witness accounts, newspaper reports, a researcher's extensive documentation, and a community's memory of a year that was unlike any other year it had lived through, ending on a December night with the sound of a bridge falling into a cold river and 46 people going with it into the dark. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.